The crystalline spires of Zephyria Prime stretched endlessly into the crimson sky, their surfaces reflecting the dying light of twin suns. Within the highest tower, Emperor Vorthak the Eternal rested upon his throne of compressed starlight, his massive form casting shadows that danced across walls inscribed with the histories of 1,000 conquered worlds. His scales, each one the size of a human shield, shimmered with an inner fire that had burned cold for centuries. The Dragon Emperor had ruled for over 3 millennia. He had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations, had crushed rebellions with a thought, and had bent the very fabric of space to his will. Yet somewhere in the vast expanse of his reign, something precious had been lost. The fire that once burned in his heart had cooled to mere embers. Wonder, joy, even anger, all had become distant memories, replaced by the mechanical efficiency of absolute power. Today marked another routine audience. Representatives from various species across the galaxy had come to pay tribute, settle disputes, or beg for mercy. Vorthak barely listened anymore. His ancient mind processed the words, made decisions, and dispensed justice or punishment with the same emotional investment he might show in breathing. The crystalline hive minds droned on about trade routes. The silicon-based architects requested permission to terraform a dead moon. The gaseous collective complained about territorial disputes with the machine consciousness of Proxima 7. Through it all, Vorthak's golden eyes remained half-closed, his consciousness drifting through memories of battles long past, when victory still tasted sweet and defeat carried the sharp sting of genuine loss. "Your Imperial Majesty," announced his chancellor, a spindly being whose species had evolved from deep-sea creatures on a world of eternal storms. "The final petition today comes from the human delegation of Terrasol. Humans." Vorthak's massive head lifted slightly. The species was relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 2 centuries ago. They were unremarkable in most ways. No natural weapons, no psychic abilities, short lifespans, fragile bodies. Yet they had somehow managed to carve out a small but respected place in the cosmic hierarchy through their adaptability and what other species called their stubborn creativity. 3 humans entered the vast throne room, their footsteps echoing in the cathedral-like space. They wore simple dark uniforms marked with the blue and green symbol of their home world. The lead figure, a woman with silver-streaked hair and weathered hands, stepped forward and performed the ritual bow required in the Emperor's presence. "Your Imperial Majesty," she began, her voice steady despite the overwhelming presence before her, "I am Ambassador Chen Wei-Lin of the Terran Federation. We come seeking safe passage rights through the Nebula of Sorrows for our exploration vessels." A routine request. Vorthak prepared to grant it with his usual indifference when something caught his attention. Behind the ambassador stood a young human male, perhaps in his 3rd decade of life. But it was not the man that drew the Emperor's gaze. It was what he carried. Cradled gently in the human's arms was a creature that made Vorthak's ancient heart skip a beat. It was small, no larger than a house cat, with scales that gleamed like polished obsidian and tiny wings that flexed and stretched with obvious delight. Golden eyes, mirror images of Vorthak's own, gazed around the throne room with the fearless curiosity that only the very young possessed. A dragon hatchling, but not just any hatchling. Even from his throne, Vorthak could sense the familiar resonance, the genetic signature that marked this small creature as one of his own bloodline. Impossible. His last offspring had been born over 800 years ago, and none had survived to reproduce. His species was ancient, powerful, and tragically nearly extinct. Each birth was a miracle that happened perhaps once every few centuries. "How?" Vorthak's voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. "Do you come to possess one of my kind?" The young human, David, his name was David Chen, the Emperor realized as he rifled through the man's surface thoughts, stepped forward without fear. This surprised Vorthak. Most beings, when directly addressed by him, either froze in terror or collapsed entirely. But this human simply adjusted his hold on the tiny dragon to ensure its comfort and met the Emperor's blazing gaze. "Your Majesty," David said, his voice clear and respectful. "We found her on Kepler 442b, in the ruins of what appeared to be an ancient outpost. She was alone, barely alive, trapped in some kind of stasis field that had been failing for decades. Our xenobiologist determined she was suffering from what we call failure to thrive, physically healthy, but emotionally starved." The hatchling chose that moment to let out a small chirp, a sound like crystal bells touched by wind. She had noticed Vorthak's attention and was studying him with the frank interest that only children possessed. Her tiny head tilted as she examined his massive form, showing no fear, only curiosity about this giant version of herself. "The medical team said she needed emotional bonding to survive," David continued, gently stroking the hatchling's neck with one finger. "Constant care, attention, and—" He paused, seeming slightly embarrassed. "Affection. I volunteered to be her primary caregiver during the journey here." Vorthak felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he had not experienced in centuries. This insignificant human had saved one of his bloodline. More than that, he had cared for her, nurtured her, given her what she needed to thrive. The Emperor could see the bond between them, could sense the genuine affection that flowed both ways. "What do you call her?" Vorthak asked, surprised by his own interest. David smiled, and in that expression Vorthak saw something he had forgotten existed: pure, uncomplicated joy. "Her name is Melody. She seemed to respond to music, so we started calling her that. She loves it when we sing to her." "Sing?" The concept seemed foreign. Dragons did not sing. They roared, they spoke, they commanded. But they did not engage in the frivolous activity of song. "Yes, Your Majesty. Would you like to see?" Before Vorthak could respond, David was already settling cross-legged on the polished floor of the throne room. He positioned Melody in his lap, where she curled up like a contented cat, her small purr vibrating through the vast space. Then, without any self-consciousness about performing before the most powerful being in the known galaxy, David began to sing. His voice was untrained but warm, carrying a simple melody that seemed to wrap around the crystalline walls of the chamber and resonate in ways that defied acoustic explanation. The song was in the human language of English, something about stars and dreams and finding one's way home. But it was not the words that mattered, it was the emotion behind them. As David sang, Melody's eyes drifted closed in contentment. Her tiny wings relaxed against her sides, and she made soft cooing sounds that harmonized with the human's voice. She was utterly, completely at peace, basking not just in the sound, but in the love that infused every note. Vorthak found himself leaning forward on his throne, his massive form focused entirely on this small tableau. The human's voice carried emotions that the Emperor had not felt in centuries: tenderness, protection, unconditional love. It was not the desperate love of those seeking favor, nor the calculated affection of political alliances. It was simple, pure, and freely given. As the song continued, something extraordinary happened. Melody began to sing along. Her voice was nothing like her species' traditional roar. It was a delicate, crystalline sound that wove itself around David's deeper tones like silver thread through gold fabric. She was not simply mimicking, she was harmonizing, adding her own melodic line to his, creating something new and beautiful from their combined voices. Vorthak's breath caught in his throat. In all his millennia of existence, he had never heard another dragon sing. It was not in their nature, not part of their ancient traditions or instincts. Yet here was one of his bloodline, barely more than a hatchling, creating music as naturally as breathing. The song ended, but its echo seemed to linger in the throne room long after the last note had faded. Melody opened her golden eyes and looked directly at Vorthak, tilting her head as if asking what he thought of her performance. In that moment, the Emperor felt something crack inside his chest, a wall that had been built over centuries of isolation and disappointment crumbling away. For the first time in 300 years, Vorthak felt tears. They were not the tears of sadness he had shed for his fallen empire in its early days, nor the tears of rage that had marked his most violent conquests. These were tears of something he had thought lost forever: wonder. This tiny creature, cared for by an insignificant human from an unremarkable world, had just shown him that even in his ancient bloodline, new possibilities could emerge. "How long?" Vorthak's voice was softer now, more uncertain. "How long has she been able to sing?" David looked up, still gently stroking Melody's scales. "About 3 months now. It started with just humming along to our ship's music systems, but she's gotten more complex, more creative. Sometimes I think she's trying to teach me new songs." The implications hit Vorthak like a meteor strike. This hatchling was not just surviving, she was evolving, growing in ways his species never had before. The human's influence, his emotional nurturing, had unlocked something in her genetic potential that had remained dormant for millennia. "Your request for safe passage," Vorthak said finally, his voice carrying new weight, "is granted. But I have a counter-proposal." Ambassador Chen stepped forward again, her diplomatic instincts alert. "We are honored to hear your thoughts, Your Majesty. I wish to learn more about this bond between human and dragon. I propose in exchange, your people may establish a permanent embassy here on Zephyria Prime. In return, I ask that David and Melody remain as my guests for a time, so that I might better understand what has transpired here." Vorthak could see the humans exchanging glances, the quick mental calculations of diplomats and scientists. This was an unprecedented offer. No species had ever been invited to establish a permanent presence in the Dragon Emperor's home system. "With respect, Your Majesty," David said, still holding Melody protectively, "I would need to know that Melody would be safe, that she would be free to leave if she chose." The audacity of the request, a human making conditions to the Emperor of the galaxy, should have enraged Vorthak. Instead, it only deepened his growing respect for this young man. David was not thinking of political advantage or personal gain. His only concern was for the small life in his arms. "She will be my honored guest, not my prisoner," Vorthak assured him. "As will you. I give you my word as Emperor, and as one who shares her bloodline." Melody chose that moment to chirp again, a sound that somehow conveyed agreement and excitement. She spread her tiny wings and looked between David and Vorthak, as if encouraging them to reach an accord. David looked down at her, then back at the massive dragon on the throne. "What do you think, little one? Want to stay and meet your great-great-grandfather?" The hatchling's response was to launch herself from David's lap, wings beating furiously as she flew in a wobbling circle around the throne room before landing with surprising grace on one of the armrests of Vorthak's throne. She looked up at the Emperor with fearless curiosity, then settled down and began purring. For the first time in centuries, Vorthak smiled. As negotiations continued around them, details of the embassy, cultural exchange protocols, research opportunities, the Emperor found his attention continually drawn to the small dragon now napping on his throne and the human who watched over her with such obvious care. Something fundamental had shifted in the cosmic order today, though none of them yet understood the full implications. The Dragon Emperor, ruler of 1,000 worlds, had been reminded that even the oldest hearts could learn to feel again, and it had taken the song of a human and a hatchling to teach him that lesson. In the days that followed, as David and Melody settled into quarters in the highest spire of the palace, Vorthak found himself doing something he had not done in centuries, looking forward to tomorrow. For the first time in ages, the future held the promise of discovery, of growth, of change. The age of the cold, calculating emperor was ending. The age of the dragon who remembered how to wonder was about to begin. The morning light of Zephyria Prime's twin suns filtered through the crystalline walls of the palace, casting rainbow patterns across the floor of David's new quarters. 3 weeks had passed since his arrival, and what had begun as diplomatic necessity had evolved into something far more profound. The rooms assigned to him and Melody were luxurious beyond anything he had ever experienced, walls that could shift from transparent to opaque with a thought, furniture that molded itself to perfect comfort, and a garden that grew food from any world in the galaxy. But luxury was not what made this place special. It was the gradual transformation he witnessed each day in the ancient being who ruled this vast empire. Emperor Vorthak had begun visiting them daily, always under the pretense of checking on his descendants' welfare. At first, these visits were formal affairs. The emperor would arrive with his full retinue, settle his massive form in the specially reinforced courtyard outside David's quarters, and observe Melody with the clinical interest of a scientist studying a fascinating specimen. Those early conversations were stilted, careful exchanges between beings separated by millennia of evolution and experience. Vorthak would ask questions about human child-rearing techniques, about the psychological principles David employed in caring for Melody, about the emotional bonding process that had saved her life. David answered as best he could, though he often felt like he was trying to explain color to someone who had been blind for centuries. But gradually, something changed. The emperor's retinue grew smaller with each visit. His questions became more personal, less analytical, and most tellingly, he began to interact directly with Melody herself. The first time the ancient dragon had reached out one massive claw to gently stroke his descendant's tiny head, David had seen something in those golden eyes that he suspected had not been there for centuries. Tenderness. It was a crack in the armor of imperial authority, a glimpse of the being Vorthak might have been before the weight of absolute power had hardened him. This morning's visit was different from the start. Vorthak arrived alone, his massive form seeming somehow less imposing without the usual ceremonial guards and advisors. He settled in his customary place in the courtyard, but instead of his usual formal greeting, he simply watched as David and Melody went through their morning routine. David had learned to treat these observations as perfectly natural. He prepared breakfast for himself and a carefully balanced meal of rare metals and crystallized energy for Melody, all while keeping up a steady stream of conversation with the hatchling. She had grown noticeably in the weeks since their arrival, her scales taking on a deeper luster, her wings gaining strength and coordination. Most remarkably, her vocabulary had expanded dramatically. Dragons, David had learned, were naturally telepathic among their own kind. But Melody had taken the unusual step of learning to communicate verbally with him. Her voice was still small and musical, but she could now express complex thoughts and emotions with surprising eloquence. "David," she chirped from her perch on the windowsill, "the ancestor watches differently today." That was what she called Vorthak, the ancestor. Never emperor, never your majesty, simply the ancestor, as if acknowledging their familial connection while stripping away the intimidating trappings of power. Vorthak had never corrected her. "How so, little one?" David asked, though he had noticed it too. "Sadness sent," Melody replied, using her own term for the complex emotional emanations she could detect. "Old sadness. Like dying stars." David glanced toward the courtyard, where Vorthak's massive head was turned toward the distant spires of the capital city. The Emperor's usual aura of controlled authority seemed dimmed somehow, as if he was wrestling with thoughts that demanded more attention than the business of ruling. "Your Majesty," David called out, "would you like some tea? I was just brewing a pot." It was a ritual they had developed over the past week. Vorthak could not partake in human food or drink, but he seemed to find the ceremony of tea preparation soothing. David suspected it reminded the ancient being of simpler times, when ritual had meaning beyond mere protocol. "That would be pleasant," Vorthak replied, his voice lacking its usual resonant authority. As David prepared the tea, Melody flew over to settle on Vorthak's broad snout, something she had started doing when she sensed the Emperor needed comfort. It was a gesture that would have been unthinkable from any other being. Touching the Dragon Emperor without permission was a crime punishable by immediate execution. But Melody seemed to understand instinctively that family operated by different rules. "You seem troubled today, Ancestor," she said, her small voice somehow carrying perfectly to where David worked. "Is it the weight of too many tomorrows?" David paused in his tea preparation. Melody's intuitive understanding of emotional states often produced surprisingly profound observations, but this one seemed to strike particularly deep. He could see Vorthak's golden eyes narrow slightly, not in anger but in contemplation. "You are perceptive, young one," the Emperor said after a long moment. "Yes, I suppose it is something like that." "I dreamed of songs last night," Melody continued, settling more comfortably on Vorthak's snout. "Old songs, from before the first star died. They were beautiful, but they made me sad. Do you know why?" Vorthak was quiet for so long that David began to wonder if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that made the crystalline walls of the palace seem to resonate in sympathy. "Because, little Melody, beautiful things that are lost forever carry a special kind of pain. We treasure them precisely because we can never have them back." David brought the tea service to the courtyard, settling cross-legged on a cushion beside the Emperor's massive form. This close, he could see the individual scales that made up Vorthak's hide, each one inscribed with minute runes that told the story of battles fought, worlds conquered, and ages survived. But today, those ancient markings seemed less like trophies and more like scars. "What songs did you dream of?" David asked Melody, though he suspected the question might be more appropriately directed at Vorthak. "Dragon songs?" she replied, her golden eyes fixed on her ancestor. "From when we were many, when we sang the stars to sleep and woke the moons with our voices, before we forgot how to sing together." David felt a chill run down his spine. Melody's dreams had been growing more complex and historically detailed over the past few days, as if proximity to Vorthak was awakening ancestral memories she should have been too young to possess. "You dream of the age of harmony," Vorthak said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have not heard those songs in over 2,000 years. Why did we stop singing?" Melody asked with the directness that only children could manage. The question hung in the morning air like an incriminating piece of evidence. David could see Vorthak struggling with how to answer, how to explain the gradual erosion of his people's culture and spirit to someone who represented their last hope of renewal. "We stopped singing," Vorthak said finally, "because we forgot why the songs mattered. We grew powerful, and power made us think we no longer needed the things that had made us whole. We thought strength was enough." "But you still remember the songs?" Melody pressed. "I can taste them in your thoughts when you're not guarding them." This was news to David. He had not realized that Melody could sense Vorthak's deeper thoughts, and judging by the Emperor's surprised expression, neither had he. "You should not be able to access my mental barriers," Vorthak said, though he did not sound angry. No dragon has possessed that level of telepathic sensitivity for centuries. Maybe I can because David taught me that barriers can also be doors, Melody replied with the simple wisdom that constantly amazed both men. He showed me that sometimes the most important things happen when we stop protecting ourselves so much. David felt a flush of pride mixed with apprehension. His approach to caring for Melody had been based on human-child psychology, emphasizing emotional openness, trust, and unconditional support. He had not considered that these techniques might be fundamentally altering her development as a dragon. "Sing one of the old songs," Melody said suddenly, fixing Vorthak with an expectant stare. "Please, ancestor, I want to learn them properly, not just taste the shadows in dreams." "I cannot," Vorthak replied immediately. "It has been too long. The voice is—" He paused, searching for words. "Dragons who do not sing for centuries lose the ability. The throat channels reshape, the resonance chambers calcify. It is a physical impossibility." "David's voice changed too when we first started singing together," Melody said pragmatically. "He was afraid and tight, but voices can remember if you give them practice and patience." She turned to David, who was beginning to suspect where this conversation was leading. "Show him the warm-up exercises you taught me." "I don't think—" David began, but Melody had already launched herself from Vorthak's snout to land on his shoulder. "Trust me," she whispered in his ear. "He needs this. His heart is forgetting how to hope, and music is the language of hope." David looked up at Vorthak, whose massive form seemed to have shrunk somehow, as if the conversation had stripped away layers of imperial authority to reveal someone smaller and more vulnerable underneath. "Would you like to try?" David asked gently. "Just some simple vocal exercises, nothing formal or complicated." "I am the Emperor of 1,000 worlds," Vorthak said. But the protest lacked conviction. "I do not exercise my voice." "You're also Melody's ancestor," David replied, "and she wants to learn the songs of her people. Surely that's more important than imperial dignity?" The challenge was carefully phrased, offering Vorthak a way to frame cooperation as responsibility rather than vulnerability. David had learned that the Emperor's pride was not mere arrogance, but a necessary shield that had protected him through millennia of isolation. Vorthak considered for a long moment, his golden eyes moving between David and Melody. Finally, he lowered his massive head so that it was closer to their level. "What would you have me do?" David smiled, recognizing the momentous nature of the Emperor's decision. "We'll start simple. Just breathing exercises, then basic tones. Melody, would you like to demonstrate?" For the next hour, the courtyard of the Dragon Emperor's palace was filled with sounds that had not been heard on Zephyria Prime for centuries. At first, Vorthak's attempts at vocalization were rough and uncertain, his voice cracking like adolescent pipes that had grown rusty with disuse. But gradually, with patient encouragement from David and enthusiastic support from Melody, something began to emerge. The Emperor's voice, when it finally found its range, was nothing like David had expected. It was not the roaring thunder of imperial commands or the rumbling earthquake of draconic rage. Instead, it was surprisingly warm, rich with harmonics that seemed to make the very air around them vibrate in sympathetic resonance. "Now," Melody said when Vorthak had successfully completed a series of ascending scales, "sing one of the dream songs. Start small, just a fragment. I'll help." "I don't remember how they begin," Vorthak admitted, his usual certainty replaced by honest uncertainty. "Then we'll make a new beginning," David suggested. "Sometimes the most important songs are the ones we create together." What happened next would be remembered in the histories of 12 worlds as the moment the Dragon Emperor remembered his soul. Vorthak began with a single sustained note, deep and resonant. Melody joined him, her crystalline voice weaving around his like starlight around a campfire. Then David added his own voice, creating a three-part harmony that seemed to unlock something fundamental in the ancient dragon's memory. Words began to emerge, in the old draconic language that predated the Empire by millennia. They spoke of stars being born, of the first flights between worlds, of a time when dragons had been explorers and poets rather than conquerors. Melody's voice carried the melody while Vorthak provided the deep foundation, and David filled in the harmonies that bound them together. As they sang, something extraordinary happened. The crystalline walls of the palace began to resonate, picking up their voices and carrying them throughout the entire structure. Citizens in the lower levels paused in their daily activities, wondering at the strange and beautiful sound that seemed to emanate from the very stones around them. In the throne room, the emperor's advisors looked up from their work in confusion, recognizing their master's voice, but not understanding how it had become something so entirely different. When the song finally ended, the three singers sat in absolute silence, each processing what had just occurred. For David, it had been the most beautiful musical experience of his life. For Melody, it had been a homecoming to cultural memories she had never known she possessed. For Vorthak, it had been a resurrection. "I remember now," the Emperor said, his voice thick with emotions he had not felt for centuries. "I remember why we sang, not for power or conquest, but for connection, for the joy of creating something beautiful together." Melody flew to him again, settling on his snout with obvious affection. "Will you teach me the other songs, ancestor? All of them?" "I will try, little one, though I fear my memory is not what it once was." "Then we'll help each other remember," David said. "That's what families do." The word hung in the air between them, laden with implications that none of them had fully anticipated. Family. It was such a simple concept, yet it represented everything that Vorthak had lost in his millennia of rule: connection, belonging, love that was not based on fear or political necessity. "Yes," the Emperor said finally, his voice carrying a certainty that had been missing since David's arrival. "I suppose that is exactly what families do." As the morning progressed into afternoon, the three companions continued their musical exploration, each song awakening more memories, more emotions, more possibilities. The Dragon Emperor was learning to feel again, and the universe would never be the same. 6 months had transformed the heart of the Galactic Empire in ways that historians would struggle to document and philosophers would debate for generations. The crystalline spires of Zephyria Prime still reached toward the twin suns. The vast machinery of interstellar governance still functioned with clockwork precision, and Emperor Vorthak still commanded the loyalty of 1,000 worlds. But something fundamental had shifted in the cosmic order, and its effects rippled outward through space like stones thrown into still water. The first signs of change were subtle. Trade negotiations that had traditionally been resolved through displays of imperial power now included clauses for cultural exchange. Diplomatic missions reported that the emperor's audiences had become less formal, more collaborative. Worlds that had expected swift punishment for minor infractions instead found themselves engaged in discussions about alternative solutions. The Imperial Council struggled to understand their sovereign's transformation. In the Grand Conference Chamber, beneath murals depicting the dragon's greatest victories, senior advisors gathered for what had become an increasingly difficult weekly briefing. "Your Majesty," Chancellor Zixith ventured, his crystalline form shifting through nervous color patterns. "The Andromedan Trade Consortium is requesting clarification on your recent modifications to their territorial agreements." Vorthak, perched on his throne but somehow appearing less imposing than before, tilted his massive head. "They are concerned about the cultural preservation requirements I added." Among other things, yes. They do not understand why an empire built on strength and expansion now concerns itself with protecting the artistic traditions of conquered peoples. The question would have once been unthinkable, a direct challenge to the emperor's judgment. But Vorthak had been encouraging such honest discourse, another change that left his advisors unsure of their footing. "Because, Chancellor," Vorthak replied with patient authority, "strength without culture is merely destruction. We have spent millennia building an empire of fear. Perhaps it is time to build something that can inspire loyalty through admiration rather than terror." Through the chamber's transparent wall, the advisors could see the source of their emperor's transformation. In the garden courtyard below, David worked with a group of young dragons who had been brought to Zephyria Prime from the few remaining enclaves throughout the galaxy. Melody, now nearly twice her original size but still small compared to her adult kin, served as both student and teacher in these sessions. The Dragon Renaissance, as the court historians had begun calling it, was spreading. Word of the emperor's renewed emotional capacity had somehow leaked beyond the palace walls, carried by servants, diplomats, and the dragons themselves, whose empathic abilities made secrets nearly impossible to maintain. Dragons who had not seen others of their kind for centuries began making pilgrimages to Zephyria Prime. They came seeking connection, community, and the songs that had been lost for so long. David had found himself at the center of a cultural movement he never could have imagined. His simple techniques for emotional bonding, developed to save one orphaned hatchling, were now being adapted to heal an entire species. Each new arrival brought their own fragments of forgotten lore, their own pieces of the puzzle that had once been dragon civilization. But it was not without its challenges. "The hegemony of steel has formally protested our new policies," Admiral Krex announced, his mechanical voice cutting through the council chamber like a blade. "They claim that the Empire's softness threatens the stability of the entire galactic order." Vorthak's golden eyes flashed, and for a moment, the old Imperial fire burned bright. "Do they indeed? And what form does this protest take?" "Military buildup along our border sectors. They appear to be testing our resolve, Your Majesty. Intelligence suggests they may be planning coordinated strikes against our more culturally diverse worlds." The Emperor rose from his throne, his massive form expanding to its full, intimidating height. "Then they shall learn that cultural appreciation has not diminished our capacity for defense. Prepare the fleet, Admiral, but first open communication channels. I wish to speak with their leadership directly." As the council dispersed to carry out their orders, Vorthak made his way to the garden courtyard where David was conducting the afternoon session. The human had developed a remarkable ability to work with multiple dragons simultaneously, helping them rediscover their voices while building the emotional connections that their species needed to thrive. Today's group included Fyroth, an ancient red dragon who had been a hermit for over a millennium; Christiana, a young silver female who had been raised in isolation after her clan's extinction; and Torvak, Vorthak's own nephew, who had arrived just weeks ago, carrying centuries of resentment about his family's emotional distance. "The harmony needs to breathe," David was saying as Vorthak approached. "Don't force the notes. Let them find each other naturally." The dragons were attempting a simple three-part arrangement, but their voices kept clashing, each singer trying to dominate rather than blend. It was, Vorthak reflected, a perfect metaphor for their species' historical problems. "Like this," Melody demonstrated, her crystalline voice weaving between the others like silk through rough fabric. "Find the spaces between their notes, then fill them with something beautiful." She had become remarkably wise for one so young, her insights often surpassing those of dragons 10 times her age. The human's influence on her development had created something entirely new, a dragon who possessed both the ancient power of her bloodline and the emotional intelligence that had made humanity such an unexpected success in the galaxy. "Uncle?" Melody called, noticing Vorthak's approach. "Will you sing the harmony line? Torvak keeps trying to sing melody, and Fyroth won't stop being so dramatic with the bass notes." The casual way she addressed the Emperor of the Galaxy still startled newcomers, but Vorthak had grown to treasure it. In all his millennia of rule, Melody was the only being who saw him as family first and sovereign second. "I would be honored," Vorthak replied, settling into the group with an ease that would have been impossible months ago. "What are we attempting today?" "The Song of Growing Light," David answered. "It's one of the pieces Christiana remembered from her childhood. We think it might be a teaching song, meant to help young dragons understand their place in the greater community." As they began to sing, Vorthak marveled at the transformation in each of them. Fyroth's voice, once harsh with centuries of isolation, had gained warmth and flexibility. Christiana's timid whisper had grown into a confident soprano that could soar above the group or provide delicate counterpoint. Torvak's natural stubbornness had been channeled into a solid, reliable bass that anchored their harmonies. And David, the human who had started this revolution with a simple act of compassion, continued to serve as the bridge between their ancient nature and their emerging possibilities. The song spoke of stars being born, of young light learning to shine alongside its stellar siblings, of the beauty that emerged when individual voices chose to blend rather than compete. As they sang, Vorthak felt the familiar warmth in his chest, the emotion that Melody had taught him to recognize as hope. When the music ended, they sat in comfortable silence, each processing the experience in their own way. It was David who spoke first. "Your Majesty, I've been thinking about what you said regarding the hegemony of Steel's protests." "Oh?" Vorthak's attention focused entirely on the human. David's insights had proven remarkably valuable over the past months. "They're not really afraid of your empire becoming weak. They're afraid of it becoming appealing. Fear-based loyalty is fragile. It only lasts as long as you're the biggest threat around. But loyalty based on admiration, on genuine respect for what you represent, that's much more durable." Christiana raised her elegant head. "The human speaks truth. In my travels before coming here, I heard whispers on dozens of worlds. People are curious about the changes in the Empire. Some are even hopeful." "Hopeful for what?" Torvak asked, his voice still carrying traces of the skepticism that had marked his arrival. "For the possibility that strength and compassion might coexist," Melody answered with the directness that always surprised the adults. "For the idea that power could be used to create rather than just control." Vorthak felt a surge of pride in his young descendant, followed immediately by a sharp pang of protective concern. "Which is precisely why the hegemony sees us as a threat. A successful example of what they call soft power undermines their entire philosophy." "Then perhaps," David said carefully, "it's time to show them that soft power doesn't mean weak resistance." The human's words sparked an idea in Vorthak's ancient mind. For millennia, he had ruled through intimidation and overwhelming force. But what if there was another way? What if the very qualities that the hegemony dismissed as weakness could be turned into a different kind of strength? "David," Vorthak said slowly, "how would you feel about representing the Empire at a diplomatic gathering?" "I'm honored by your confidence, Your Majesty, but I'm not a diplomat. I'm just a xenobiologist who got attached to a baby dragon." "Precisely. You are living proof that connection and understanding can transcend species barriers. The hegemony expects us to respond to their provocation with traditional military might. Instead, we will invite them to witness something they believe impossible." Melody's eyes lit up with understanding. "A gathering of dragons, singing together, showing them that we've rediscovered what they think we've lost. More than that," Vorthak continued, his excitement building, a demonstration that our new approach creates real strength, not weakness. David, would you be willing to help organize a cultural festival? Something that showcases not just dragon traditions, but the cooperative achievements of all our member species? A festival? Fyroth's voice carried centuries of skepticism. You propose to answer military threats with music and art? I propose to answer military threats with proof that our way of life is worth defending, Vorthak replied firmly. Fear may compel obedience, but it does not inspire sacrifice. If we face invasion, I want our people fighting not because they must, but because they believe in what they are protecting. The following weeks saw a frenzy of activity throughout the Empire as word of the upcoming festival spread. David found himself coordinating with cultural ambassadors from hundreds of worlds, each eager to contribute to what was being hailed as the first truly collaborative celebration in galactic history. The responses were overwhelming. The crystalline hive minds offered to create architectural sculptures that would sing in harmony with the wind. The gaseous collective volunteered to provide atmospheric displays that would paint the sky in colors visible to every type of eye in the galaxy. The machine consciousness of Proxima 7 announced they would compose mathematical symphonies expressed through precise movements of their construction fleets. But it was the dragons who provided the festival's beating heart. Dragons who had not seen others of their kind for centuries worked together to reconstruct the great song cycles of their ancient past. Young dragons learned from elders who had thought their knowledge would die with them. Voices that had been silent for millennia joined in harmonies that made the very stones of Zephyria Prime resonate with joy. Melody thrived in this environment, her natural gift for emotional connection helping her serve as a bridge between dragons of different ages and backgrounds. She had become not just Vorthak's descendant, but a symbol of her species' potential for renewal. 3 days before the festival was scheduled to begin, the hegemony of Steel's response arrived in the form of a massive battle fleet positioned just outside the Zephyrian system. Their message was simple and direct. Abandon the festival or face immediate military action. Vorthak's response was equally direct, but carried a subtle challenge that the hegemony's leaders could not ignore. You are welcome to attend our celebration as guests, the Emperor announced in a galaxy-wide broadcast. Come, see what we have built. Judge for yourselves whether cooperation has made us weak or strong. We invite you to bring your finest warriors, your greatest leaders, your most accomplished minds. Let them witness what emerges when beings choose to create rather than merely conquer. The challenge was perfect. The hegemony could not refuse without appearing cowardly, but attending meant giving legitimacy to everything they opposed. After heated internal debate, they agreed to send a delegation, though one heavily armed and prepared for treachery. The festival began at dawn on the day of the autumn equinox, when Zephyria Prime's twin suns created perfect symmetrical shadows across the crystalline landscape. David stood on the palace balcony watching as beings from across the galaxy gathered in the great plaza below. The sight took his breath away. Delegates from 1,000 worlds mingled in displays of cooperation he had never imagined possible. Trade negotiations were conducted through interpretive dance. Territorial disputes were resolved through collaborative art projects. Scientific discoveries were shared in languages of light, sound, and electromagnetic resonance. At the center of it all, dragons soared through the sky in complex aerial ballets, their voices joining in songs that had not been heard for millennia. The sound carried across the plaza, through the crystal spires, and out into space itself, where monitoring stations recorded harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate with the cosmic background radiation itself. It's working, Melody said, perching on David's shoulder, as she had during their first meeting with Vorthak. She was larger now, but still chose to maintain their original closeness. The fear scent from the hegemony delegation is changing, becoming curiosity scent. Indeed, David could see the hegemony representatives in their reserved section, their rigid military postures gradually relaxing as they witnessed the genuine joy and creativity surrounding them. Children from dozens of species played together without fear or suspicion. Artists collaborated across barriers of biology and culture. Warriors from traditionally hostile civilizations shared techniques and strategies with obvious mutual respect. But it was the evening's main event that truly demonstrated the power of what they had built. As Zephyria Prime's suns set, creating a canvas of stars across the darkening sky, every dragon in the system joined their voices in the grand harmony. A song so ancient that its origins were lost to legend, but so beautiful that it spoke to something fundamental in every sentient heart. Vorthak's voice provided the deep foundation, centuries of authority transformed into notes that spoke of protection and guidance rather than dominance. Melody's crystalline soprano soared above the chorus, carrying hopes for a future that transcended the limitations of the past. Between them, hundreds of other voices wove melodies that told the story of their species' long journey from isolation to community. But the most powerful moment came when David stepped forward and added his human voice to the dragon chorus. He sang not in Draconic, but in the common trade language that most species understood, offering words of welcome, acceptance, and hope for continued cooperation. As his voice blended with theirs, something unprecedented happened. Beings throughout the plaza, not just dragons, but creatures from every world in the Empire, began to hum along. The harmony spread like ripples in a pond, encompassing thousands of voices in dozens of languages, creating a sound that had never existed before in galactic history. In the hegemony's observation area, David could see tears on faces he had not expected to be capable of such emotion. Their leader, a massive warrior whose species had been bred for conquest, stood with his head bowed, overwhelmed by the beauty of what he was witnessing. When the song finally ended, the silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. The hegemony delegation remained for 3 more days, participating in workshops, attending cultural exchanges, and gradually abandoning their preconceptions about what strength really meant. On the morning of their departure, their leader requested a private audience with Emperor Vorthak. The conversation was brief, but transformative. "I came here to assess your military weakness," the hegemony commander admitted. "Instead, I have witnessed something that makes our entire philosophy seem incomplete." "Strength and compassion need not be enemies," Vorthak replied. "Power shared is not power diminished, it is power multiplied. We would like to discuss the possibility of cultural exchange programs. Perhaps our young warriors could benefit from learning what you have discovered here." 6 months later, David stood once again on the palace balcony, but now the view was entirely different. The plaza below hosted a permanent cultural center where beings from across the galaxy came to study, create, and collaborate. Dragon song schools had been established on dozens of worlds. The Empire's military remained strong, but it was now supplemented by soft power that made actual conflict increasingly rare. Melody, now approaching adult size but retaining her playful nature, perched beside him with obvious contentment. "Are you happy with what we've built?" she asked, using the directness that had become her trademark. David considered the question, watching as young beings from 100 species learned to harmonize together in the courtyard below. The Empire was stronger than ever, but its strength now came from loyalty freely given rather than fear imposed. Worlds that had once been conquered territories were becoming genuine partners. The galaxy itself seemed more peaceful, more hopeful. "I'm proud of what we've built together," he replied, "but more than that, I'm excited about what we might build next." Vorthak's massive form settled beside them, the Emperor's presence now associated with warmth and protection rather than intimidation. "The council has approved the proposal for a new university," he announced, "an institution dedicated to studying cooperation across species barriers. They want to name it after you, David." "Name it after all of us," David replied immediately. This was never about one person's contribution. It was about learning to listen to each other, to sing together despite our differences. "The Harmony University," Melody suggested with a musical laugh, "where beings learn to find their voice while helping others find theirs." As the three companions watched the sunset paint the crystal spires in shades of gold and crimson, David reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had started with a simple act of compassion, caring for an orphaned hatchling who needed love to survive. From that small beginning had grown something that transformed an empire and touched every corner of the galaxy. The Dragon Emperor had remembered how to feel. The dragons had rediscovered their voice, and humanity had proven once again that the greatest victories were won not through conquest, but through connection. In the years that followed, historians would mark this period as the beginning of the Galactic Renaissance, an age when cooperation triumphed over conquest, when diversity became a source of strength rather than division. They would study the political implications, analyze the economic benefits, and document the technological advances that emerged from unprecedented collaboration. But those who were there, who witnessed the transformation firsthand, would remember something simpler and more profound. They would remember the moment when the most powerful being in the galaxy learned to sing again, and how that single act of rediscovered joy rippled outward to touch every star in the sky. The universe, it turned out, had been waiting for someone to remind it how to harmonize. All it took was a human, a dragon, and the simple recognition that the strongest bonds are forged not through dominance, but through the courage to be vulnerable together. The age of the Dragon Emperor's cold reign was over. The age of the galactic harmony had begun, and at its heart beat a simple truth that David had discovered while caring for one small orphaned creature. Love, shared freely and without reservation, was the most powerful force in the universe. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility and resonant with the promise of songs yet to be written. Together, they would compose symphonies among the stars,